Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Baltimore, and welcome to Reality Asserts Itself. A few weeks ago, we did a series of interviews with Chris Hedges, and one of the things we talked about was the weakness of the left, the weakness of the people's movement, if you will. Well, we're going to continue that discussion now, and Chris joins us again in the studio. Chris, as everyone probably knows by now, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and a senior fellow at the Nation Institute, along with Joe Sacco. He wrote the New York Times bestseller Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, and he writes a weekly column for Truthdig. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So, last time we talked a lot about something you had said in 2008, and you've written more recently about one of the gravest weaknesses of the left was not creating a viable vision of what an alternative politics and economy looks like, a viable vision of a socialism. But you've written more recently about some other weaknesses of you could say, of the people's movement. And here's one, and I'll read it back. This is a piece you wrote called Let's Get This Class War Started, which I guess is a play on Pink's song, is it? Right. Let's get this party started. The quote is, "The inability to grasp the pathology of our oligarchic rulers is one of our gravest faults." What are you talking about?
Because we don't understand the pathology of the rich. We've been saturated with cultural images and a kind of cultural deification of wealth and those who have wealth. We are being, they present people of immense wealth as somehow leaders, oracles even. And we don't grasp internally what it is an oligarchic class is finally about, or how venal and morally bankrupt they are. We need to recover the language of class warfare to grasp what is happening to us. And we need to shatter this self-delusion that somehow if, as Obama says, we work hard enough and study hard enough, we can be one of them. The fact is the people who created the economic mess that we're in were the best educated people in the country. Larry Summers, former president of Harvard, and others. The issue is not education, the issue is greed. And I, unfortunately, had the experience of being shipped off to a private boarding school at the age of 10 as a scholarship student, and I was one of 16 kids on scholarship, and I lived among the super rich, and I watched them. And I think much of my hatred of authority and my repugnance for the ruling elite comes from having been among them for so long.
Yeah, people don't understand the elite schools, even at the high school level, right, that the kids get excellent educations, but they learn the whole culture of hundreds or thousands of years of how to rule.
Right.
And it's a deep, rich understanding of it.
Not only that, but they, and George Bush is a perfect example of that.
Well, not so much an example of deep, rich understanding.
No, but of how, affirmative action for the rich. And I came, certainly on my mother's side of the family, from, lower working class. I mean, one of my uncles lived in a trailer in Maine, and certainly people with no means. And I would juxtapose the world I was in with that world. And it was very clear that it wasn't about intelligence or aptitude. The fact is, if you're poor, you only get one chance. If you're wealthy, like Bush, you get chance after chance after chance after chance. So you're a C student at Andover, and you go to Yale, and you go to Harvard Business School, and you're AWOL from your National Guard unit, and you're a cokehead, and it doesn't really matter. You don't even really have a job till you're 40, and you become president of the United States. So that was what was particularly insidious, how those small, tight, elite, oligarchic circles perpetuated themselves and promoted mediocrity, because many of these people, like Bush, are very mediocre human beings, at the expense of the rest of us. And how with money, they game the system. And of course now we live in an oligarchic state where we've been rendered utterly powerless. And the judiciary, the legislative, the executive branches, all subservient to an oligarchic corporate elite. And the press is owned by an oligarchic corporate elite, which makes sure that any critique of them is never broadcast over the airwaves.
And it's not some like inherent evilness or something, but you are brought up as a super rich or very rich in a culture, in a school, in a milieu where everyone's there to serve you. It's your right to be served.
Yeah, it's very distasteful to see because, you know, I would go to the homes of friends of mine and watch, and let's remember they're children, 11, 12 years old, ordering around adults, their servants, their nannies. And I begin that piece by talking about Fitzgerald, who came from the Midwest to Princeton and went through much the experience that I went through. And that apocryphal exchange, which didn't take place, but it does represent the difference between Hemingway and Fitzgerald, where Fitzgerald at one point had written, but the story is that he said the rich aren't like you and I, and Hemingway is supposed to have quipped, yes, they have more money. Well, Hemingway, like on many things, was wrong. The rich are different, because when you have that much money, then human beings become disposable. Even friends and family become disposable and are replaced. And when the rich take absolute power, then the citizens become disposable, which is in essence what's happened. There is a very callous indifference. I mean, these people, and C. Wright Mills wrote about this, and the power elite, they're utterly cut off. I mean, the only people they ever meet who are members of the working class are people who work for them. They're gardeners or they're chauffeurs. They live in self-encased bubbles. They have no real contact with reality. I mean, they don't even fly on commercial airlines, and yet they have absolute power. Now, that becomes very dangerous politically because they're so out of touch. And they are able to retreat into their enclaves in the same way that you saw in France under Louis XVI, people retreating into Versailles, or the end of the Chinese dynasty when everybody went to the Forbidden City.
He's après moi le déluge, is he not?
Yeah. And that's, I think, you know, so that they will extract more and more and more because they have no self-imposed limits without understanding the economic, political, and social consequences of what they're doing. So we have a popular uprising through the Occupy movement where people pour into public spaces to express legitimate grievances. Student debt, the next bubble to go down, $1 trillion in debt, which we now saw, courtesy of our Congress, debt rates will, interest rates will actually go up in a couple years. I mean, more than if they'd just taken it from a bank. It's insane. And meanwhile, the Federal Reserve is buying $85 billion a month worth of junk bonds and giving money at virtually 0% interest to Goldman Sachs. I mean, it's insane. The failure to address the mortgage and foreclosure crisis, the failure to address the chronic unemployment, underemployment, which, I mean, half of the country now lives in poverty, including the working poor, or near poverty. And what is the response? The response is to physically shut down the encampments, suspend unemployment benefits, cut food stamps, close things like Head Start. It's crazy. And that's what happens when you have an elite that is that unplugged, which our elite is. So they will push and push and push myopically out of ignorance until something erupts, and that's exactly where we're headed. So did I. I mean, and I think that's what I'm getting at. Exactly. I mean, you know, I wrote in that column about, you know, being at this boarding school and watching these fathers pull up in their limousines, fathers who had very little contact with their sons, with their personal photographers, and these were famous, wealthy men. And that picture of them playing with their son, which was total fiction, would be disseminated through the press. Yeah, amorality, hedonism, selfishness, callousness.